Just recently, I returned from a trip to Vietnam to hang out with my unpaid project manager, and despite her warning that I didn't have time, I wanted to get one more big video out before I left, which obviously I f***ed up. So I gave a multiple choice question to a few friends to see what ideas seemed best to make within a tight deadline, and one of those friends told me to do a Castlevania video. That wasn't an option, but I decided to ponder it a bit. Castlevania isn't a series I necessarily grew up with besides Symphony of the Night and Dracula's Curse, but it's one I've learned to love and respect over the years. I especially adore the Igavanias by Koji Igarashi. But I'm not here for Igavanias today. We're talking about some good old-fashioned classic Vania. Ass-widening difficulty, stiff controls, and simple stage 1 to stage 2 progression, which I love this shit too, just for a different reason. I had to think carefully about what I'd do for this video because I can go on for hours about a few entries, so I thought, hey, how about I look at every version of Castlevania 1? That seemed like a good short dealio. There's Castlevania 1, Super 4, Chronicles, and maybe one other I'm forgetting. Might take me 2 half days of getting footage tops. I was wrong. So first, let me set the ground rules for what I actually mean here. Castlevania 1, as we in the West know it, is the NES game, and some ports we'll get to. That itself is not today's parameters. See, in Japan, Castlevania 1 is known as Akumajou Dracula, which roughly means Devil Castle Dracula, Demon Castle Dracula, Akuma Castle Dracula, and every retelling of the original Simon Belmont vs. Dracula story is just called Akumajou Dracula. So while the video is titled what it is for SEO reasons, I'm actually looking at every Akumajou Dracula. To prevent confusion, I'm going to mainly refer to each by their Western names since they have unique ones outside Japan. With the parameters set, the answer is actually more difficult than you'd think. If we ask how many unique Akumajou Dracula experiences are there, the obvious answer is 5. In the West, these would be Castlevania for NES, Vampire Killer for the MSX2, Haunted Castle in the arcades, Super Castlevania 4 on Super Nintendo, and Castlevania Chronicles for PlayStation 1. However, if we break down our definitions pretty loosely, we can debatably have 14 versions. All of them just called Akumajou Dracula in Japan. We've got 8 more versions of the NES game on flip phones, arcades, and old home computers, plus 1 extra version of Chronicles on the Sharp X68000 PC, which was actually the first version of it. So yeah, we've got somewhere between 5 and 14 versions of Castlevania 1, unless we also count in emulations and screen-crunched Game Boy Advance ports. Are any of them good? Is there a definitive version? Are there shitty versions? Yeah, there's certainly a lot of those ones today. Before we get right into it with Akumajou Dracula, I want to give a big shout out to iCarrotKD on Twitter.com. He made the updated Nova Zone intro here. He's skilled in animation and motion design, so if you want something along the lines that I have, why don't y'all hit him up. He'll be in the description of every video using this intro. At the very least, we can jump in with something good. Castlevania 1 on Nintendo Entertainment System, which would go on to be the basis for every Castlevania game onwards. Surprisingly, we know little about Castlevania 1's development history. Even in retro Japanese gaming circles, it's considered mysterious. That's partially because only the third NES game had a real credit sequence, which you only see upon finishing the second loop. Castlevania 1 only had a gag credit sequence with references to movie stars like Christopher B. and Boris Karloffis, while Castlevania 2 just doesn't have credits at all. Because of this mystery, most of what I can find comes from a Japanese Twitter user named @360Leo, who claims to have been mentored by the NES game's lead programmer and Castlevania's likely creator, Hitori Akamatsu. His tweets are in Japanese, but Shmupulations has a nice translation of some of them that I'll link down below for anyone who wants to read, which I definitely recommend because Akamatsu sounds like a funny guy from these. Like, apparently the reason Konami ripped stuff off from Alien frequently was because Akamatsu raved about how great the movie was around The Office, yet never put Alien stuff in any of the games he directed. Interesting stuff in here if you want the smallest glimpse into the mind of Castlevania's first writer. Most relevant today, 360Leo said that the team stayed together throughout the NES trilogy, meaning we can use Castlevania 3's credits as a basis for how many people were on this. So if we assume the unlikely scenario where it's the exact same people every time, we've got about half a dozen people since Castlevania 3's credits were a dozen people and half of them were special thanks. Though it's also possible that Castlevania 1 had even less than that. That small team luckily seemed to help with making sure the team kept a consistent gothic horror vision that pays homage to Western films the team loved, going right down to a film reel on the title screen. Speaking of the intro, due to the nature of today's video, I luckily just need to go over the story once, so that's pretty nice. nice. And like many NES games, the story isn't actually in the game, but the manual. Actually, just the Japanese manual. Luckily, the Anniversary Collection reiterates it for us. Legends say that every 100 years in Transylvania, when the power of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, is weakened,
Mormon Jesus,
the Akumajou Dracula will return due to the prayers of those with wicked hearts. So far, man has resurrected Dracula once before, but was stopped by Christopher Belmont. Now, on Easter night, heretics outside of town poured blood onto the corpse of Count Dracula to bring him back to this world. The only one who can stop Dracula and his forces of evil is another Belmont, as their clan is destined to ward off evil using their family heirloom, the vampire killer whip. Enter Simon Belmont, the great-grandson of Christopher. In Dracula's wake, he ventures forth to storm Dracula's castle by himself. It actually surprises me how much the original Japanese manual sets up the series' future and tells us about the world's past. Christopher Belmont would star in the Game Boy games taking place roughly 100 years before Castlevania 1, which had Dracula's first resurrection. While 100 years before him, Trevor fought Dracula in his first life as King of the Night, meaning it wasn't a resurrection at that point. Technically, these were supposed to be the same story at one point, but that's for a Castlevania 3 video. It also introduces the vampire killer whip's status as the Belmont clan's prized holy possession, though not by name in the original manual. That moniker didn't come about until the Genesis game, which in Japan is actually called Vampire Killer. Describing this story as Dracula's second resurrection also sets up future adventures, since that means the Belmonts don't know how to permanently end Dracula yet. Every 100 years, Dracula will come back, and the Belmonts are burdened with ending him, giving us a new Belmont and a new Dracula castle every game. And sometimes a convoluted way he comes back between those 100, but that ain't relevant today. I find it's an effective way to keep the same setting with new level layouts. Dracula's Akumajou isn't just brick and mortar. It's Dracula's soul manifest in physical form, and just as a soul, the castle changes over time. I absolutely love this setting. A story of a family destined to fight a vampire and his minions goes hard as fuck. And as the series went on, each Belmont got more nuanced with how they view their duty, or even how they view their lack of duty in their life. But I guess that's not today's subject. Instead, let's turn to Dracula, since he is the one in the title. Since the series seldom has a main character for more than 2 adventures, I'd argue the greater narrative follows Dracula more. How Dracula came to be, who wishes to bring him back for what reasons, and even his final fate come into play throughout the series. Given the creator's love for film, it feels like a cheeky reference to the Hammer Dracula films and how he'd come back to life for whatever new reason. Speaking of those film references, I love how Castlevania shows a high level of respect to its inspirations. Castlevania 1 has a giant bat, Medusa, a mummy, Frankenstein's monster, the Grim Reaper, and Dracula himself. All inspired by some film that, if referenced today, or even since the 70s, would play up the ham of their classical depictions. I'm not a prude, so of course I get a chuckle from those parody depictions. I just also love seeing Castlevania tap into the true, serious, gothic horror of those characters. It does it so well that this depiction of Dracula, once developed across the whole franchise, is maybe my favorite depiction of the character. He's tragic, powerful, intelligent, sexy, everything I expect from Dracula. Even underneath that first layer of being fucking Dracula, there's a certain compassion he shows, both to his family and other monsters. Perhaps we can view Dracula's castle as somewhere other monsters can find solace. And because of that, those monsters respect him for the fear that he imposes onto humans who don't dare enter it. Perhaps comparable to how Romanians revered Vlad Tepes for his use of fear tactics against the Turks, Ottomans, and all other enemies. Enough of the story though, it takes a serious backseat to Castlevania 1's gameplay. First off, Akumajou had a pretty good sense of game design for his era and a clear vision. Unlike Mario, he wanted to make sure every minute action a player made in Castlevania had consequence. You shouldn't have a chance to save yourself after a minor mistake. Looking at Simon's jump, the moment you press A, Simon endures through his arc. If your arc heads towards a pit, death, and if an enemy comes toward you, the only way to prevent it is with an attack. And you're making a promise every time you attack too.
I accept the deal.
Simon takes so long to attack that you won't have time for more than one whip and maybe a sub-weapon per jump. while attacking on the floor brings him to a complete pause. You need to know when and what you're attacking, as well as with what, which sounds daunting at first, but Castlevania gives you more than enough time to analyze that, and these weapons present some of the most versatility I've seen on NES outside of Mega Man. First of all, Simon's whip. Akumajou chose the whip because he felt it matched the tone of gothic horror the best, worked as an extension of the player, and because he liked Indiana Jones. Now let's go back to that extension of the player idea. A lot of games follow that idea, and often it comes with a precise sense of control like Spider-Man. Peter leaps loosely around and you control all of his acrobatic motions. Well, Castlevania is going for the opposite. It's an extension of how you're pretty crafty, but have shoulders too broad to enter the porta potty. Humans are clunkers when compared to spiders, hedgehogs, or Italians, and Castlevania makes that clear to you. Instead of flexing your jumps and body movements, you gotta use some ingenuity. So this whip, it goes pretty far. In the most literal sense, this is an extension of Simon's horizontal attack. It reaches a natural midway point not seen in games of the time. Further than a sword like Ninja Gaiden, but closer than a gun like Contra or Mega Man, all examples that came out after this game. Our first two levels show you what that reach can mean. First enemies you see are these ghouls that rush at you randomly from left and right. It seems overwhelming at first because of Simon's slow nature. No way can you attack this many individual enemies. However, unlike shooters where the bullet stops once it hits one enemy, the whip slices right past Ghoul 1 to Ghoul 2, and if timed properly, Ghoul 3. Compare that to Ryu's sword, which can maybe get 2 enemies if you got the perfect setup. Simon's range makes it so we're not battling 5 enemies, we're fighting 2 directions with a reasonable piece of power against them. Not only does his whip allow for getting multiple enemies, it lets us get distant ones too. We start getting enemies right on the other side of pits in the second stage, enemies that take too many hits to jump and attack at a close range. So now you've got a whip from the other side before jumping over, or even these fire-spewing skulls that have just enough space where you can get both their fireballs and the main body in one clean whip stroke. It's a versatile weapon even by its first appearance. But as I said, the whip only covers 2 directions for now, which is where these sub-weapons come in. This is another point Akumajou made a deliberately strange decision. A lot of weapons of this type usually try to make it where everything has a use somewhere. Every weapon in a well-balanced game like Mega Man 4 gets used somewhere, and if a weapon didn't have a use, then it's because Mega Man 3 is a released beta. Akumajou purposefully made some of the sub-weapons worse than others. Getting into it, sub-weapons, whip upgrades, and the hearts needed to use them are normally found in candles. You can only hold one sub-weapon at a time, and you've got to hold up on the D-pad while attacking to use them. So you need to carefully choose which of the 5 you have and when. Down the list, there's the knife projectile that hits one enemy, an upward arcing axe, a downward AoE holy water, the multi-hit projectile cross that's better than the knife, and a stopwatch that freezes enemies. Akumajou designed the cross and holy water to be objectively better than the axe, while the knife is meant as the worst option. If you see a knife and you have something else, you want to make sure you don't grab that. Now, mostly they cost 1 heart each, but Stopwatch thinks himself a romance option and requires 5 hearts before you use it. Anyway, the reason that you need to hold up is to accommodate the NES's small button layout, but it's also a tiny extra step with the benefit of making sure you don't accidentally use it too often while still being easy. Additionally, that button layout and the heart counter means you're not only comparing sub-weapons to each other, but the versatile whip as well. You don't want to waste your hearts, and you also don't want to waste your time. Back to that first room with the ghouls, you're already prepped with the knife before you go in, but you'll notice that using the knife here really isn't as helpful as the whip since it only hits one enemy. Knife icky, so you end up not using the sub-weapon until you find the next one to try, the holy water. You obtain it in a high ground area, the perfect spot to use a weapon that aims downward. Now you realize that some sub-weapons are better than others, making you want to experiment. Level 2 then takes it to the next stage. It gives you a cross right out the bat, the sub-weapon you want to keep for the whole level. Only problem, you lose it upon death. A possible situation when Castlevania is hard. I've told you all these options Simon has, plus why he's so clunky, and you still gotta know how to utilize them, where to find health, and how much more stage you have left. Castlevania lands in this balanced point where it gives you enough time to analyze your room, while still wanting you to memorize the layout in an arcade-like manner. Level 2 tries to drive that home for you by having bottomless pits with respawning flying Medusa heads. Their spawn rate is at a speed where you need to keep the exact rhythm expected if you want to get through the room room easily, and that rhythm isn't too bad if you have the cross. However, die to this once, and you're locked out of the cross until you get a game over. So now your only option for that room is a knife found right after the checkpoint. Personally, I think the whip's also easier to use in this room, but I think you'll get the idea. Simon doesn't have access to everything at all times. You need to make do with what's offered. Playing a stage or even the whole game effectively helps to ensure you have what you want at all times, which a lot of people consider this one of the hardest games on the system, but I think Infinite Continues evens it out to where I'd call this game fair. I'm not getting sent back that far for any time I mess up, and the stages are pretty damn short this time. Even spots where enemies continuously respawn go at a set rate, and due to some kind of programming magic, spawn at a certain distance from Simon so you have the time needed to react. Level 4's intro stage is a good example of this, where the mermen jump from reasonable distances from Simon. Not once have I had a merman jump into me on Castlevania for Nintendo Entertainment System. All of these aspects about Simon's control and the level design make Castlevania a perfect game for those that want to stop and think about their environment. But for me, it gets even better once you try not to stop. I consider every platformer to have a separate barrier between playing slowly and playing quickly. Sonic has a medium-sized barrier to go at the intended speed, while the faster speeds are only a little bit harder. Ninja Gaiden is about the same barrier for both because you cannot play that game slowly, and Castlevania 1 has a low barrier for slow play and a ginormous one for speedy play. Discounting glitches, there are many spots you have to stop and think. These instant death crushers, slowly moving knights that will certainly hurt you if you try jumping over, and especially bosses. Castlevania is one of the earliest games I'd say has actually memorable bosses. Bosses that challenge you with a true sense of skill. Keep in mind, Mega Man was still a year away, and let's not pretending that jumping over Bowser once is anything compared to, the Grim Reaper. If you want to beat a level of Castlevania with 1 health left, honestly, you can probably do it. Just know that Medusa's gonna suck the life out of you. When you reach the bosses, you need to go in with the intended weapon, because at that point, they aren't too bad. That just also means you gotta get to them with that weapon. And for some, full health is another must. I'm gonna use Death as an example. Death is pretty tough whip only. He goes to each corner of the room while his sides attack you, so you're trying to balance hitting him or his sides. Even Akumajou said he couldn't beat him without the cross, which absolutely fucks him up. Main problem is reaching Death with a reasonable health bar. These 2 rooms before him are brutal. This one has skeletons you've gotta slowly guide away from the stairs, while the second room has a long walk consisting of respawning Medusa heads that knock you back, and these axe-throwing knights that take tons of hits to kill. These 2 rooms are designed as the perfect beginner's trap. You 100% see the challenge in front of you, but don't know how to get through without a few tries. And once you finally pass it, you come to realize that you actually need to beat it with full health if you want a chance at beating Death. I know this sounds like I'm describing basic game design, but please remember that bosses like this weren't seen in platformers at the time. Same period Castlevania came out, the big game was Metroid 1. And if you think the same spot missile spam Sponge Ridley is on the same tier as fucking Frankenstein, you're on crack.
Oh, yeah!
Castlevania kinda throws away the idea of hard stage before a boss once you get to Dracula though. I mean, yeah, the stage before him is absolutely the hardest one. Like, the first boss comes back as a normal enemy, bottomless pits with jumping flea men, a generally hard area. It just balances that out with letting you continue from Dracula's room, ensuring that you have full health, hearts, and your choice of the cross or holy water. They knew Drac was hard, so they gave you everything you need and infinite tries for him. Vlad's first phase shows the ultimate test of, do you know what to do? So I kinda did 3 runs for this video. Once where the game froze before I fought Death, again where I beat it, and once more after I played the later versions. I spent a while fighting Dracula the first time because I completely forgot the strat when I first got here. You cannot just hit his weak point when he shows up, and learning his pattern is so fun to me. Especially because during that next run, I knew exactly what to do, had what I wanted, purposefully retried so I could do it with full health, and beat him on my second attempt. That was satisfying. Simon's defeated Dracula, and the monster born of man's curse, allowing him to finally rest. Such a short, challenging, and satisfying game. Castlevania 1 is a title that's easy to pop in and give a good run through, though it's also kind of hard to not want to master it. You were made a bitch by the game, so now you want to make it your bitch with the skills and tactics you've learned along the way. It's this idea that I feel all of the good Castlevania games have presented. Push you around so that you either hone your skills or devise a smarter tactic to get through your problem. Note that I said good Castlevania games, because it's time for everything else today. So a shit ton of today's games are directly based on the NES title. Same level design, same weapons, same bosses, none of them surpass the original in quality. We've got 8 other versions of the NES game on arcades, PC, and flip phones. Additionally, 4 other revisions on the NES game on Famicom and NES. I am not counting these as separate versions, but I'll mention them for housekeeping. There's a Famicom Disk System version with a slightly shuffled sub-weapons and a save function, 3 different revisions on the NES that just affects which glitches you find, and a cartridge Famicom release with an easy and hard mode. These are effectively the same games. Though as a warning, the current retail collection uses the ROM from the NES's first edition, which has a game-freezing bug at Death's Walkway sometimes. I ran into it during my first run while recording, so I just want to let y'all know there are save states in this version. Make sure that even if you're doing a fat cock no death run, you make a little save state when you get here. Now the real stuff. 2 arcade releases, 3 old school PC releases, and technically 3 flip phone releases of Akumajou Dracula. Emulating these were a bitch, so I'll let you know what happened as I go. First, the flip phone releases. They came out sequentially in Japan on different hardware, with only the second one leaving the country on Java phones, which was the only version I could find a ROM of, hidden inside of a 1000 Java ROM zip file with other classics like Casino Wii and Catch the Sperm. The other 2 versions, to my knowledge, are lost to time. If you have them, feel free to email me, because they look a lot more interesting than the Java port. On Java, it just reuses assets from other entries in the series, while the first port is a lower graphics version with smaller rooms, and the 3rd edition has this weird, realistic look I'm interested to see. But we just have the Java version, which is definitely what I'd expect from Castlevania on Java. Music doesn't loop, slow down, a weird floaty feeling, wonky hitboxes, screen crunch, everything you'd expect. What makes it unbearable though is the sub-weapons. Anytime you hold a sub-weapon and have hearts, you can't immediately use your whip. So those ghouls in the first room, you have to use the knife now if you have it. All the other shortcomings sucked, but this one alters the game heavily for the worse. For example, if you have the axe and an enemy comes at you from the front, you need to mash attack to make sure you get a whip out right after the axe. This means you can't conserve hearts anymore, which is arguably worse than the other problem. Because of that, I'm gonna tell y'all the biggest shocker of all time. I don't see a point in playing this version of Castlevania. Moving on, the arcade versions are kind of funny. Versus Castlevania released first on the Nintendo Vs. arcade machine. Nintendo Vs. was a series of arcade machines released after the Famicom using its hardware so that Nintendo could place their home console games in the arcade, either exactly as is or slightly altered. While the second arcade release was on the PlayChoice 10, a less popular cabinet that could hold up to 10 NES games in it with a small screen up top giving directions. Think of it like Nintendo's own Neo Geo. Versus Castlevania is basically the same as the NES version, except it has an altered color palette, you take more damage, and the timer, practically ignorable on NES, is far more strict. I have never suffered a timeout in the original game, while I ran into one on the second stage here when I played at a pretty good speed. Versus Castlevania is your typical arcade quarter muncher. I'd assume the color palette swap was also made so that you could see the screen easier in certain environments like a laundromat or a dark arcade. I mainly think that because it's the only change kept for the PlayChoice 10 version. At least that's what I've read. I couldn't get the PlayChoice 10 version to play after 10 minutes, and given what I read, I decided it wasn't worth wasting more time on. Again, I don't see much point in either of these, but you can buy Versus on the Switch and PS4 for $8, which is almost half the price of Anniversary Collection, so I'd say go ahead and skip them. Same goes for the PC ports, but this is the interesting part. Let's fucking go. We've got 3 home PC releases in the 90s. Unlike everything else today, these are the first ports not developed in-house by Konami. The Commodore 64 and MS-DOS versions were developed by Distinctive Software, now known as EA Vancouver. They mostly made underperforming PC ports like Metal Gear, Altered Beast, and Super C. These all look like shit. Hope that gives you a hint on what we're about to see. While Novotrade International, later Appaloosa Interactive, and now defunct, handled the Commodore Amiga ports. I'll skip the wait, these are all all actual shit. And I don't like up and calling games shitty online. It's why usually when I make videos, it's about subjects that engaged me. I want to get others into what I've been thinking about. I especially don't like assuming a stance of objectivity with art, since by nature, it's subjective. And taking that objectively negative approach can sometimes feel weird. I know that most of the time if a game is flawed, there's some kind of outside reason that caused it, like tight schedules, working on inferior hardware, poor communication with the publisher, or maybe it's something that straight up isn't for me, like most first-person shooters. These PC ports of Castlevania are objectively inferior works to the NES game. Let's start with the Commodore 64 port, because that was the biggest issue for me. Emulating all of these was difficult due to PC emulators trying to look like the machine they emulate, which for the Commodore 64 resulted in my worst outcome. I got it all up and running pretty easy, but I couldn't actually control the game much. I eventually got Simon to control with a numpad, which meant total destruction to my fingers. 0 to whip, 8 to jump, 5 and 6 to move, just a layout that wasn't healthy. So I went into the settings to map a controller, and that didn't end well. I went through 3 controllers, multiple third-party keybinders, full reinstall, and every option available to end up with not even being able to use the numpad anymore. So I sadly had to give up, which sucks because this was probably the most competent PC port. It's obviously visually weaker than the NES, and I think you had to hold attack for sub-weapons, but it actually felt kinda like Castlevania. For the weak hardware they're working with, I must commend what they got going here. Too bad those same guys fucked up the MS-DOS port. First off, this is the worst one to run. Unlike you DOS kids, I had a good childhood with 3D Pinball Space Cadet, so turning it on, mounting DOS games, running the Castlevania CD, and turning on Castle every time I needed to change settings was monotonous bullshit to me. I had to do that a lot. The emulator I was using had 4 graphics settings and 3 for sound. I'm not an MS-DOS expert, but I'm assuming this has to do with upgrades to the system. Of course, I selected the bottom options first since I figured that would be the best ones, and wouldn't you know, I got Numbervania. So I start working my way from the top, and I'm greeted with the ugliest fucking mess I've seen. I'm likely making the footage small and darker to not give y'all headaches right now. I didn't make it very far like this. I even woke up sick on the day I played this, started feeling a little better when I got to play it, and stopped even more ill. This wasn't happening for me. Next option was the same but darker, and the third one is what I assume is intended to play. So after that hassle, it's still shit. Castlevania is a side-scrolling action game, and you'll notice this fucker jitters every time you move. Additionally, this shit still has some weird floaty jump, plus wonky ass hit detection. Honestly, the footage does not do it justice. Like, it doesn't look good here, I get it, but playing it, ugh. Fuck, that's even worse. The extreme jitter makes every tiptoe feel like loading a new PowerPoint slide. Even if underneath everything this is Castlevania on NES, a well-designed title, I can't get past this headache-inducing stutter. I had to stop a little after Medusa when I got my first game over. There's no continues, and I knew there's no way I was beating this shit. Apparently there's a save and load feature in this and the Amiga port, but I did not figure that out. I don't know what the fuck is wrong there. And yeah, the Amiga port. Graphics are kinda, sorta good, but not at all. No, it's bad. I mean, if you give me a screenshot, I'd tell you it looked better than the NES. Fancy HUD, a few more bits, made me think this port wouldn't suck, so I decided I'd actually beat this one. Then it moves, and after playing for 2 minutes, it became apparent to me it's the worst one. Besides the jittering, there's 2 things that make this experience non-functional, and one that's lame. I'll start with the latter. This art style is disgusting. I said before that I love how the original Castlevania has a serious respect for gothic horror. It plays everything absolutely straight with designs emphasizing their horrific nature. Amiga don't do that. Everyone looks straight out of a middle school horror house. The kind that got an F. Knights look like scuba divers, ghouls came out of Scooby-Doo, and the Medusa heads are the old lady from Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I can't take this seriously, and it gets tough to look at with this color palette. I've realized while seeing my footage, Castlevania 1 is good at differentiating the foreground, background, and Simon. Level 1 has a white and green background, brown floors, and Simon's a bright yellow. Then level 4, blue backgrounds and orange floors. You can differentiate everything, so even if the sprite flickers, cause it's an NES game, you never get confused. Makeup makes fucking everything red. Backgrounds, foregrounds, hazards, these are not easy to differentiate from Simon's brown and yellow sprites. The only room I thought looked alright was the sewer, which artistically looks like a swampish area. Although I've never envisioned it like that, and no other version has given me that impression. Speaking of that room, both of the breaking points of the Amiga port are here in full force. There's no feedback when you do anything, and the random enemies are too fucking random. any goddamn attack, hit you take, and most items you gain carry no weight to them. Simon isn't an extension of yourself anymore. He's a guy kinda doing things. For example, if I was standing inside of a candle in the original game, I'd still whip it. In the Amiga port, I need to stand far away from my hit to land, which in some instances, like these falling instant death spikes, can lead to death. It gets worse because of the random enemies. I mentioned that the original game was good with making sure enemies don't spawn in bad places. They appear at reasonable distances for you to attack. Not in the Amiga port. Respawning enemies come out quickly and in places not normally allowed in the NES version. It makes getting hit completely luck-based in some rooms, which in the sewer can mean instant death. Thankfully, the version I downloaded had an option to turn on infinite lives, and I decided I don't feel bad about that at all. It did not matter what the fuck I did in some rooms, it didn't get beat till it decided I beat. I'd perform the exact same steps, the exact same whips, at the exact same milliseconds, and shit would still go differently. Living and dying came completely up to chance. Eventually I realized that patience was less likely to win than rushing through an area. If I stood still to whip a merman, 2 more mermen came out in that time. And for some reason, Simon doesn't suffer knockback all the time. No logic to it, just sometimes he goes back, other times he doesn't. His invincibility frames are also busted this go around, so yeah, I decided I'd just go forward until the room was beaten. That worked out more often than playing as intended, but not like a fun, oh haha, I bested you kind of unintended, just unintended. Playing this and the DOS version back to back was some of the least fun I've ever had in a video game. I'm not exaggerating here. My eyes were burning, my patience thinning, and I had to stop at death. I fucking made it to him with full health twice and just had to call it off here. I wanted to say I beat at least one PC port, but I was feeling legit ill with this. Calling it off at least left me with the solace that the worst was over. At the same time that Konami had one team make Akumajou Dracula for NES, they had a separate team make an Akumajou Dracula game for the MSX2 home computers that came out 1 month later. To my knowledge, Konami has never clarified what version began development first, but given that Akamatsu is called to whip his idea and he's not credited on the MSX2 game, I think it's more likely they started with the NES game. Now, to this day, the only release of this one outside Japan was a 1987 release in Europe as Vampire Killer, so VK's been pretty elusive to me. I always just figured it was a slightly altered version of Castlevania, maybe a better one. But I'm gonna start out by telling y'all that's wrong. I didn't have fun here. First thing to notice, this game doesn't have scrolling at all. I thought the MSX2 was powerful enough to handle that, but after looking up videos of top MSX2 games, I noticed the only ones that had it were shmups. And too many of y'all put this in the top 10, telling me none of y'all finished this. I'm guessing this lack of scrolling also motivated their design decisions, because Vampire Killer isn't a typical 2D action game like its NES counterpart. Instead, it's what I can only describe as an early Metroidvania prototype. Each stage at its base is definitely derivative of the NES version. There's 6 stages with the same bosses and some rooms ripped straight from it. Where it differs is the progression. The 6 stages are now broken up into 3 parts consisting of multiple screens. Once you begin one of the 3 parts, these screens normally loop around with a few vertical levels as well. You're stuck in Vladdy's loop until you find the big key to open the progression door. And how is that done? Different in each area. You either bullshit or piss easy, normally hidden in a fucking wall. Anyway, this game doesn't follow the traditional Castlevania item system. In fact, the only true sub-weapons are the stopwatch and holy water, while the knives, axes, and crosses are upgrades to your regular weapon. I'll come back to this. You can also find boots to go faster, a shield to take less damage, other stat changing things, and a parchment that I'm only just now learning is a map you can open using F2. After figuring this out, I begrudgingly turned the game back on to check, and wouldn't you know it, this doesn't really make a big difference in most rooms. It just tells you where the exit is, which is usually the easiest thing to find. And finding it doesn't even fucking matter if you don't have the big key. I digress. Sometimes you find stuff in a candle or enemy drop, but usually not. Instead, the good stuff comes from treasure chests that require small keys, shopkeepers that want an extreme amount of hearts from you, and a lot, I mean a lot, of secret walls. I'll start there. I have never had to break this many walls in a Castlevania game. Most of the classic games aren't too bad about it, about 2 to 3 walls to break per stage, and it gives you health or another high quality item. Vampire Killer makes you break a block every time you want to wipe your ass. Every block looks the same, and you're gonna learn early on how often they hold secrets. Usually the large keys are in them. I think I ended up whipping every wall at least once during my run. It gets tedious and slows down the pace exorbitantly. Now the treasure chests, they don't sound bad at first, except you need one small key to open them and you can only carry one at a time, unless you find a rare funny stick that opens 3, and some of these treasure chests have nothing of value. In fact, most rooms ration keys in a way where you can screw up and miss a chest with something good in it, which is a lot easier done than said. Even if there's another key in the area I can bring there, Vampire Killer's big problem will get too soon deters me from backtracking. And the shopkeepers. They're either hanging out in the middle of nowhere or hidden inside of blocks. I wasn't sure what to do with them, so I started whipping, and apparently that's how you talk to them. Sort of. You don't just whip them once to talk to them. You gotta whip them a few times. How many? It's different for every fucking shopkeeper. Sometimes it's 1 whip, sometimes it's 10. There's no indication, and I can't figure out what the fuck is wrong here. Once you whip them enough that they turn red, you can get close to see what their item costs. If it's too much, then you can walk away until you have enough hearts. Except if you whip them on accident one more time after they turn red, you've locked yourself out of buying their wares. The only option to undo this is by dying, which, hey, you have only 3 lives in this game. I've seen no way to get more lives, and you've got 0 continues. So that thing I said about perfect memorization in Castlevania 1 is taken up to an inhuman degree by my opinion. And if it was just memorization, then it wouldn't be that bad. But there is one more flaw that overtakes any idea Vampire has, and that's the enemies. Between every screen, enemies respawn. And yeah, that doesn't sound too bad if it weren't for how small these screens are. There's a lot of places where dodging a hit is impossible. Not only do enemies get placed in stupid plain sight areas, breakable walls, and even the fucking candles spawn slimes. To my recollection, not a single other game in the franchise has hazards hidden in candles. But here comes Vampire Killer deciding that candles can fucking kill you. Candles have been taught to us as the safest thing to ever whip in the series. They shouldn't have slimes in them in a game with 3 lives and no continues. In fact, guessing and checking shouldn't exist in a game that punishes you this heavily for a wrong guess. On top of that, external factors aren't the only problem in Vampire Killer, because Simon controls fucking wretched. Physics feel jank like the other PC version, so I'll skip over that, because they also fucked up the sub-weapons. So cross, knife, and axe. I mentioned they replace your normal weapon, yeah? Well, you can also lose the axe and cross quite easily. You can only have 1 of them at a time, and if you don't catch it on the way back or pick it up when it sticks to a wall, you lose it completely, which also downgrades your whip back to the first level. See, every version of Akumajou Dracula has 3 whip levels. I didn't mention it long earlier because most entries pretty much immediately get you back up to level 3 after any checkpoint. It's a long-standing feature in the series that I felt was only used well in Bloodlines, where there's a supercharged 4th upgrade. Something so inconsequential that Rondo of Blood lacking it changes nothing. In Vampire Killer, the axe and cross make it too consequential because having these 2 items hinder you more than they help you. Vampire Killer's whip is pretty fast compared to other entries, so only having 1 attack out at a time like the axe and cross is a downgrade. And even if you use it and purposefully don't pick it back up so you can use the whip again, you're back down to whip level 1. So no matter what, the moment you grab an axe or cross, you've brought yourself back down. The dagger's actually good this time though. Simon can spam it and it doesn't use hearts, so if you have a chance for it, grab it. You just won't get that chance much since it costs a fuck ton of hearts, and even if you have a bunch of hearts, you might suddenly notice they're all gone. Why? Because of the holy water and stopwatch. So you can have both of them at once now. And since you have 2 of them, that means the whole up and attack thing won't really work. To combat that, Vampire Killer set it so that you have to jump to use them. Tap the D-pad left or right for holy water, down for stopwatch. Only usable when in the air, and whenever you tap the D-pad, you end up wasting 5 hearts per use. All of Vampire Killer's problems amalgamated into a giant mess for the final stage for me. So to be clear, I did abuse save states often. The game was giving me bullshit guess and check design, so I do not feel bad about it. But even with my save states, the game found a way to exhaust me in the final level. So I walked into the final area with 2 lives and a little bit of health. After going through it a bit, I decided to play it on a fresh life so I could have a full health bar. I figured it didn't matter much because I had 2 left and I'm using save states anyways. What I didn't realize is that you have to possess the dagger to beat Dracula unless you want to fight his second phase for a solid 6 minutes. And if you want the dagger, you gotta buy it from a shopkeep for a shit ton of hearts at the start of the area. The only way to have that amount without a long period of grinding this night is by playing the whole area, getting the key, and then walking back to the first shopkeep and buying the dagger. But this gives you another problem. You can not dodge these slimes, and some other slimes are placed in nearly impossible spots to dodge, making your chance of reaching Dracula with full health very unlikely, meaning that you still might find yourself grinding this night to buy a healing potion from another shopkeep right outside Dracula's castle. So I did just that after trying and failing over and over again. And finally, I have enough hearts for the shopkeep. I whip him to buy my potion, and who would have thought when I talked to him last time, I whipped him one too many times and now I can't barter with him. He fucking dies. Meaning that I had to load an even earlier save state so I could do it all over again. If I wasn't using save states, that would mean I had to start the game again. This last attempt, I made it to Dracula with about 2/3 health and decided to give it another go at this point. Despite the bullshittery of the stages, Vampire Killer's bosses are actually pretty pathetic. If you have at least like 1/3 health, you can just spam attacks on them and they'll usually run out of health before you do. Drax Phase 1 is piss easy with the dagger, so that was fine. Phase 2 just follows the damage sponge rule. If you start with more than 1/4 health, sit up at this corner and spam the knife at his jewel, you'll be fine. No clue how to dodge the bats, but I don't give a shit anymore. This was some of the most miserable I've been playing a Castlevania game, and I'm glad I'm done with it. In its defense, they developed Vampire Killer at the same time as the NES counterpart. Vampire Killer didn't have a standard to follow, and as we'll see with the next game and some future Castlevania videos, those standards weren't even solidified for a few more years. We could have very well lived in a world where the Akumajou Dracula series followed Vampire Killer's blueprint instead of Castlevania's. And I guess you could almost argue it even did with the Igavania formula. Although I can't find any information on if Igarashi ever played Vampire Killer, so I'm not gonna attribute this as an inspiration for him. He's typically cited Simon's Quest, Zelda, RPGs, and Super Metroid for his formula, so that discussion can wait for a more relevant video. Though speaking of Metroid, Vampire Killer probably would have come out better if it released longer after Metroid. The gap in release was only 2 months, so the developers didn't have time to take any inspiration from it, if they even played it. Metroid never sold in Japan quite like it did out west, so who's to say if it was even on their radar. Maybe I could come back to it with a different mindset, but I'd rather just play good Castlevania games, or the few I haven't tried yet. But speaking of ones I haven't tried yet, I got one more bad game today. Haunted Castle, or Akumajou Dracula Arcade, was an original arcade game Konami made 2 years after Vampire Killer and Castlevania. Since it released in America and Europe before Simon's Quest, most people kinda assumed that Konami weren't quite sure what name to stick with in the West and wanted to test one more name. After all, Castlevania 2 was called Dracula 2 Seal of the Curse in Japan, so there wasn't a precedent yet for anything name-related. Vampire Killer only releasing in Europe and Japan is the obvious reason they didn't keep that name, and ditching Haunted Castle comes from the game's failure in arcades. It did slightly better in Japan due to having the Akumajou Dracula name, but not a whole lot. Not much of a surprise when you know the development history, which for the first time in this video I can actually share a little bit. There's a book called The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers by, forgive me for this one, Jon Shipinyak. In it, he interviews Japanese developers that worked in the game industry during the 8 and 16-bit eras, including Masaki Kukino, the director of Haunted Castle. For Haunted Castle, Kukino said that he was brought onto the project when the team already made an absolute mess in a 5-month period. So the head of Konami took Kukino and his team off of a different project to try fixing Haunted Castle in 1 month. That time period probably gives a hint on what I'm about to say. Most Castlevania fans and even Kukino don't consider Haunted Castle that good. First off, the story is slightly changed. Instead of Simon going to kill Dracula because of his family's duty, it's to save his wife after Dracula swoops in on his wedding night. A change for the worse in my opinion, though maybe they thought they could stand the machine next to Ghosts and Goblins and fool people with the better graphics. Actually, before I say what I hate, Haunted Castle looks and sounds really good. It's mostly expected of a late 80s arcade game, which was nice after I played those shitty PC titles. Vibrant and dreary colors, detailed bosses, and even the regular enemies have more than a shitty blob to them. It helps to push forward the gothic horror aesthetic found in Castlevania. I love the snake-like hand motions Medusa gives on level 1, Frankenstein's monster's chain animations, and I'm just now noticing the harpies in this weird psychedelic sequence have nipples. A lot to love here. Only thing I don't love is Simon himself. He's normally got the cool Soviet strut, but in Haunted Castle he looks like me after I got the 3X Spice Bulldog. Anyway, I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. Haunted Castle is a quarter-sucking arcade game, and I could really stop there if I wanted to, but I've already accepted this video as long. Just like Vampire Killer, there's a constant barrage of traps you can only dodge if you know about them. Falling backgrounds, weird amounts of enemies, odd checkpoint placements, you get the idea. And unlike Castlevania 1 where you had infinite continues or Vampire Killer where you at least already bought the game, Haunted Castle needed you to spend more quarters and it had limited lives. In the North American version at least. From what I can tell, the Japanese release has infinite continues, or maybe it's just the Japanese release on PS4 I played, which playing here also circumvents the more quarters option because I just paid $8 up front. And even with infinite continues, it's still a slog at the easiest setting. Every time you die, which is often due to the low amount of damage Simon inflicts and the high amount enemies give, you've got to sit through a slow continue screen just to go back to a checkpoint that's often far back. I'm not even in an arcade, and this shit still got on my nerves. I feel like I should hate this more, but I think Vampire Killer and the PC ports kinda stole my energy by the time I got here. I played all of those back to back, so Haunted Castle's short hour-and-a-half romp didn't leave me with that big of an impression, so I wanted to get it over with. We're at Super Castlevania 4. And I know that might look weird for us Western colonizing burgermasters, but this is actually another Akumajou Dracula in Japan. See, there's not a single Castlevania game with a number higher than 2 in Japan. Even Castlevania 3 was called Akumajou Densetsu there. Maybe I'm about to sound a little blasphemous, but I actually like the Japanese naming scheme better for these 4 titles. It better separates Trevor's story from Simon's and makes it more clear that this isn't a direct sequel to Castlevania 3. Actually, none of the 4 16-bit Castlevania titles share staff with the original 3 NES games, or even each other. The original NES staff got separated after Castlevania 3 couldn't compete with Konami's Ninja Turtle games, which is super unfair because those sold a fuck ton, and that team eventually got laid off. Because of that, Castlevania Chronicles, Rondo of Blood, Bloodlines, and the Super Nintendo's Akumajou Dracula had different teams. And that Super Nintendo team decided they wanted to make a back-to-basics title, which meant remaking Castlevania 1 again. A remake that a lot of people consider the best. Though to spoil this and some future Castlevania videos, this is my least favorite of the 16-bit games. So unlike the PC ports that tried to be the NES games, or Vampire Killer and Haunted Castle that reimagined the Simon vs. Dracula story with a different gameplay loop, our last 2 games we're looking at are what I'd more closely call remakes of Castlevania 1. Well, actually they did alter the story slightly. Instead of a dark cult reviving Dracula, lightning strikes his grave and he just comes out. A little lamer, but it's Castlevania 1. This isn't the title people look to in the series for masterful storytelling. What people actually love about Castlevania 4 is the stage design and Simon's control. And yeah, I can't disagree. Simon controls great, so I might as well start there. Simon's had a complete overhaul this time around. Sub-weapons were moved to the R button, you can change your jump in midair, and the big one, fast-paced 8-way whipping. If you're a fan of Castlevania 4, this is probably why. It completely changes how you play as Simon. Before, when you saw a candle, had to jump and whip. Now, you just need to whip diagonally. Fireball coming from directly above you? No problem, just whip it. No other game in the classic series gives you this much control over who you're playing as. It furthers the idea that Simon is this badass, no-nonsense warrior trained from birth to take down Dracula. And I love the stiff Castlevania game since no other game feels like it, but if you look at Super 4 as the funny whip game in the series, there's a unique appreciation I have for it. It's honestly not something I think every entry should have kept, though as a feature in one game in the series, I quite like it. You get to feel badass way easier here than in other Castlevanias, mainly because these control options let it flow faster than the games before it. Like I said, you needed an arcade-like memorization to know what's coming in the NES title. Know what's next and take your time to think about it. Now you can just jump forward, and if your reflexes are good enough, then you can stop whatever's in your way. You've got leeway with making mistakes now, and I think that makes Super 4 a good Castlevania to recommend for newcomers. By far, I consider this the easiest Castlevania title, though Castlevania 1 competes a bit since I know it better and it's half the length. Super goes from 6 short stages seen before to 11 longer levels, and these 11 give a sense of gothic horror better than any other version of Castlevania 1. The Super Nintendo was a powerful piece of hardware, and they did their best to make Super 4 look amazing. You'd forget that this is an early title on the system. All 11 of these stages break away from what Castlevania 1 had, and they're not afraid to test the Super Nintendo's power. We see what they've got as early as the title screen with an ominous fog overtaking the text scroll, and then level 1 has moving greenery from the wind, and it lets you step between the background and foreground. Then level 3 clamps down on you with a claustrophobic feeling tunnel, stage 4 starts to turn the stage, and level 9, holy shit. It's got all this gold covering the floors while spirits come out from the floor, perhaps implying these are the damned souls that dared steal from Dracula's wealth. There's also a new implementation of a grappling hook gimmick. I'd say it's aight. It doesn't go too far, but given all this team added for their first Castlevania game, I can forgive how little they did with the grappling hook. It flows naturally when there's only one at a time mid-level, and the few parts when you need to hang on and dodge enemies can get tense. Overall, I feel badass when I pull it off, and getting all the extra goodies makes it worth it. And while Simon feels badass, Super 4 has some stage layout issues that make me feel kinda weak. Super 4 loves throwing vertical rooms at you, and these aren't that good. Ones going downward have a tendency to put enemies at the only spot you can't quite reach, while upward ones make it so touching the area that's already scrolled up kills you. It gets the worst in the final stage where this auto-scrolling buzzer makes you rush it, made worse by these collapsing stairs. You gotta jump on them and start going up with no hesitation, but I didn't realize that holding jump freezes you on stairs, so I'd have the button held for a frame or two after I finished jumping and died for a reason I couldn't quite discern. A similar problem with these turning platforms when you jump on them. You've got like 1 frame to jump off of them before dying instantly, and there's 2 that you have to jump on to beat the game. Besides those bits, everything else stands out more from the aesthetics than anything else. Layout is pretty close to standard Castlevania fare, with the altered controls just changing how you interact with stages. Although, it leads to the extra equipment like the axe and the holy water to not have much of a use. Like, the cross has always been the best option, it's just now you don't really want to try any of the others at all. The only times I found them useful were for bosses that had large hitboxes like the Twin Dragon. Due to the axe's arc, it'll land a few more hits than the whip. Actually, Super 4's bosses are really easy, and that's probably its biggest shortcoming. I get this impression while playing that the new team looked at Castlevania 1 and 3 and tried to replicate those for a lot of these, but then realized pretty late that the rigid NES designs don't work for the adaptable Simon. Simon whips really fast compared to most bosses' stun periods, so pair that with the cross and you can absolutely wail on most bosses. Additionally, holding down the whip button makes Simon use the whip as a shield, which can block a projectile after you hit them. It's actually something used well at a few of the bosses. I just wish they got a little harder earlier, because as is, it doesn't get hard until right before Dracula when you fight Pterodactyl, Firebrand, and Death in a row with no sub-weapons. Pterodactyl is such a large sprite that it teeters on the edge of being annoying, while the second two are actually legitimately fun, Death especially. In addition to the sides he throws at you, he has a gravitational pull and an even bigger sight that you can barely jump over, making the chance to hit him exhilarating. Easily my favorite boss in Super 4, though Drac isn't bad either. Before you fight him, there's a secret staircase you can jump at over here that'll get you full health, a cross, and a fuckload of hearts. The perfect setup to take on Vlad, who's one of the easier Dracula fights once you have this. But man, does this one put on a show. He'll increase fireball numbers, spout electric pillars from the ground, and only ends once the sun shines onto him. For a long time, I thought Castlevania 4 was my favorite way to play the Simon vs. Dracula story. The refined controls, extended playtime, and overpowered Simon had me hooked on it. And now, coming back to it after all the shitty ports made me happy. Though in my replays, I came to appreciate the original Castlevania 1 a lot more, so I'm not really sure which of those two I prefer. Though that question mattered a little bit less to me when I realized I had one game left at this point, because after I gave it some practice, it took the place for favorite version. Castlevania Chronicles took me by surprise. I've always slightly known of its existence, but I thought that it was literally just a better looking Castlevania 1. No one's ever sung its praises or called it a big piece of dookie, so I didn't have any rush to get into it. I'm guessing a lot of people put it down early or never tried it, and I can guess why. First of all, this is two more versions. Chronicles originally released in Japan as, take a wild fucking guess, Akumajou Dracula on the Sharp X68000 home computer in 1993. An arcade-powered machine that costed yikes! That price tag limited who'd play Chronicles, even within Japan. At the very least, the one interview I can find makes it seem like the team were excited about the power they got to work with. The director stated the team thought Castlevania 1 was the best game in the series, so they wanted to do it justice by improving upon it. Give it a graphical improvement, change the controls a tad, alter some levels, replace others completely, and add new stages. Because of that, it follows Castlevania 1 more closely than Super 4, while still adding enough original elements to be its own experience. And that own experience meant being hard. The devs thought that only hardcore gamers would have an X68000, so they made it hard as balls. So hard that they'd get letters from players saying they couldn't pass level 2. That reception partially guided the PS1 version. Sometime after Symphony of the Night, that team decided to port and slightly alter the X68000 game for PS1, releasing in May of 2001 in Japan, a full year after the PS2 came out, which is the other reason you don't hear about it. Releasing a PS1 game in 2001 isn't good marketing. 2001 was stacked with new PS2 games like Devil May Cry, Final Fantasy X, and even Konami's own Metal Gear Solid 2. Even if Chronicles beat those to shelves by a few months, it didn't have a chance to reach a wide audience. Either way, it got a third chance on the PS3's digital store, which is how I'm playing it. The old school PC emulators were pissing me off, so a no setup required release was looking pretty nice. First thing you'll notice, you've got two options to pick, original and arranged mode. Original is the PC version, while arranged is the altered edition for PS1. They're essentially the same with only small changes. On arranged, you take less damage, suffer way less knockback, Simon and Dracula get new sprites, and all the music has gotten a sick rave remix. This is my favorite of the Akumajou Dracula soundtracks. Let me stop for a minute, I've been waiting to talk about music. I didn't mention it earlier to avoid stopping 5 times to say Castlevania has good music, because I knew now was the time to say it. Besides the shitty PC ports, every version of Akumajou Dracula has a banging soundtrack. Yes, even Haunted Castle and Vampire Killer. They sparked so many classic songs like Vampire Killer, Simon's Theme, Wicked Child, and all of them are at their best in Castlevania Chronicles. They have a fast-paced, upbeat attitude using slap bass, electric guitar, violins, choir, synthesizers. I didn't even know you could make EDM sound like gothic horror, yet here we are in Castlevania Chronicles. Easily my new second favorite soundtrack in the series after Symphony. This alone makes arranged mode more worth playing than the original one for me. Though the other changes felt warranted. I mean, I guess the sprite change is debatable. I actually like it though. I know Simon's original design is the iconic one, it's what they put in the phone games, Smash Bros, Bomberman R. I just like this redesign Ayami Kojima made. It fits with the post-Symphony of the Night vibes. The red hair, fur, belt, and motivated demeanor also differentiate him better from other Belmonts than his previous look for me. He's not just a He-Man looking guy, though I'll admit that still has its appeal. Neither designs are bad, I like them both. I just like this one a little bit more. Anyway, the actual game. I started by trying out original mode. I knew the differences between each, so I expected original mode to totally kick my ass into the other one, and that's halfway true. I thought I'd get widened by stage 2 when I actually made it to stage 5, the clock tower, before I raged to the other mode. I'll get to why that is in a bit, just know for now that I'm mainly talking about arranged mode. I went back to beat original mode off the recorder later on, so I can still easily say I like arranged mode for the aesthetic reasons I mentioned earlier and the gameplay ones I'll get to. Starting out, you'll find that Simon handles at the exact middle point between NES Castlevania and Super 4. You can only whip forward and back on the floor, whip down and diagonally down in the air, sub-weapons back on up B, and you have a slight control of your jump direction mid-air. A nice balance so level design can feel like the NES game again with useful sub-weapons, while also maintaining the speed Super Castlevania 4 granted with the downward whip and jump alteration, which you'll get a good sense of Simon's feel with the first stage, a mostly faithful recreation of the NES game's opening level. The only changes is that it lengthens the underground room and puts Fleaman where health used to be. It's a good prep before level 2 throws a mostly new stage at you. It's this underground sewer, a little reminiscent of stage 3 in the original. The kicker here comes at the end with a raft running upwards. It hits a bunch of platforms that makes it get smaller while mermen pop out to shoot fire at you. My strategy when I first played was crouch in the center to dodge fireballs, which is not at all what you're supposed to do. You actually want to stand right in the center and aggressively whip the mermen to make sure you don't get hit. It's a little scary on original mode because of the knockback. Even then, once you know what to do, this room's fine in both modes. Even the boss can be pushed over with the axe. Going on to level 3 is when Chronicles' real problem starts to show up. It's filled with gotcha moments. Parts when you're playing like normal and something you didn't expect hurts you. For starters, these angel statues pelt you with arrows that can mess you up if you don't decide to deal with them fast enough. And more annoying is when you make it to the ice cavern midway. The very start has a pillar you need to step on before jumping to another platform. If you don't duck while on the pillar, you get instant killed by some spikes that are hard to see with the HUD. I thought I was fucking up a tight jump since I couldn't see it until one of my friends watching me pointed it out, although maybe the detailed blood on the pillar should have alerted me. Moving on, level 5 is when I quit it with original mode. And after thinking on it, this may win for worst level in a good Castlevania game. It starts out alright, a bit harder than the last 4 stages, that's how linear progression works, and then you get to the third portion. This room is a fucking nightmare. A huge fucking game of gotcha even President William Clinton couldn't handle. Y'all can see this room has a dark green background. Tons of cogs on that background. A few of these cogs pop out and attack you, and by a few, I mean like 7 or 8 cogs. There's barely any indication it happens until you know they happen. Like, they stick out a tiny bit compared to the rest of them, but you won't be able to tell because A, everything else that sticks out is a bright red, yellow, blue, white, anything but fucking green, and B, this room goes vertically. So you jump up to where that cog is just to find it suddenly taking 3 points of health, or 4 on original mode. And right after all this, you've got one of the hardest bosses in the classic series. A lightning speed wolfman that jumps around and throws debris at you. You have literally no chance at beating this stage blind. Taking even one cog hit puts you at super disadvantage for that boss. It just fucking sucks that they fucked this stage up so much because the 4 stages before it and the 3 after are so fun. Like, even the following level also consists of 2 vertical rooms and damn good ones at that. First one is a downward part, so if you're good enough you can skip the stairs and just whip what's below you, followed by a badass bridge collapse, and then an upward clown section leading to a wacky mirror room. This is so cool. Even the mirror room also has falling mirrors that attack, but hey, they actually stick out, are initially placed next to enemies you're going to whip anyways, and the trickier ones give you enough time to jump out of the way. Like, this whole stage is just breaking the last room in half and making it good. And I want to be a little nicer now, it's just that the clockwork room set a very sour taste in my mouth. I think after that stage, I decided I wanted to hate the game, and once I finished it the first time, I kinda did. Every minor problem stuck out to me a lot by this point, and I wish it didn't. Like, let me be clear, I plan to play each of these games once for the video, but the one and I guess extra half run on Original and Chronicles didn't make me feel confident enough to write on this one. And man, am I glad that I gave it a second shot, because I almost missed out on a new favorite of mine. And these last two stages pushed that so much for me. The first one is heavily based on Death Stage from the original, with more enemies, tougher traps, admittedly a few gotchas, and the coolest visuals. Swinging scythes in the middle, this monster that pops out at the start, and the big one near the end during the famous Walk to Death, you have an amazing looking outdoor scenario, which then slowly tears to reveal itself as a painting with more whack-ass artwork afterwards. The attention to detail in all the backgrounds is astounding, and man does this level show it. Even the room itself feels more manageable than the NES game. If you've mastered Simon's diagonal whip, you will sweep this room. Then the new fight with Death, my new favorite in the Akumajou Draculas. It goes back to the original Death fight's design, this time with the super scythe from 4 and his gravity. Except this time he pulls you into the center of the room while he throws tiny skulls at you. I was not sure what to do here, and then I realized I have to fucking whip those if I want to win. Took a lot of tries, well-timed crosses, rare healing item on one run, and perseverance to win. I felt so badass. And then the final stage, holy shit, absolutely Kino. It will destroy you on your first go. It's filled with knights with varying ranges for their weapons, and they're placed in positions where you gotta know the perfect way to dodge them. Some of these fights with the knights feel like a true fencing match, and I fucking love that. On my first run, I was here for a long time, over an hour. But you know, when I came back for the second run, beat it in 10 minutes. I made this level my bitch, and that felt so good. Like, these fire dudes and the bats, I could not stand them first try, and now I don't fear them. I was pumped to take down Dracula. He's pretty much the same as the original fight, but Simon's increased versatility and honestly just the sprite work make it feel way grander. And that's Castlevania Chronicles, the final two versions of Castlevania 1. A surprise new favorite for me. Despite a few gotcha moments, the feeling of strength, balanced versatility, and wild soundtrack made this my new favorite version of the story. If you only gave this one playthrough and came out with a negative opinion, I implore you to give it a second shot, because it becomes so much better on a second run. It exemplifies that feeling of mastery that Castlevania 1 gave me. Except now there's no way to play this one casually. It's master or bust, which I know limits the appeal, but I think those looking for that will absolutely love it if you can sink the time into it. So that's every version of Akumajou Dracula. All other re-releases of the story were emulations of what I've gone over on Virtual Console, PSN, or Collection, so I'm not going to count those. Replaying all of these back to back and doing the research has helped me to view the Classicvania series in a bit of a different light. I didn't know how mysterious the development was on the NES games, and obviously didn't know how many versions I had to look at. Especially learning the little there is to hear about Akumajou's game design ideas has given me a greater appreciation for the first title. Looking outside of the NES game also sets up some better context with how Konami saw the series at the time. It didn't have a consistent gameplay vision. They weren't even sure if it was a linear platformer or adventure game at first. The only constant they knew to have was gothic horror, which I'd say none of the at least 5 main versions of Akumajou Dracula screwed up. I guess that speaks to the strength of Castlevania's aesthetic identity. And while I may have gone through a lot of pain both in setup and experience to play a few of these, I'm still glad I did it. Vampire Killer increased my appreciation for the later games way more, and obviously I would have not found a new favorite in Chronicles if I hadn't sat down and done this. Lately, I've kind of been trying to end my videos with a look to the future in whatever series I'm talking about, and I don't want to go that far with Konami at the moment. It seems like they have a bit of an initiative to do games again with the new Silent Hill, but I don't know. Either way, Inti and Igarashi have been doing Bloodstained, plus Grim Guardians that just came out like 2 weeks ago at this point, which I guess I'll say now that's the next video. It won't be a very long one, but look forward to that. Hope to see you guys again.